Who exactly are you waiting to hear from? Whose permission, whose nod, whose blessing, whose now's a good time are you sitting around for before you let yourself change something that actually matters? Here's the strange thing. Most of the people that I know who are quietly unhappy with their lives aren't unhappy because they don't know what they want. They know. They've known for a while. What they don't have is the sense that it's allowed. Today, I want to talk about that gap, the space between knowing and allowing. My claim is that most of us aren't actually short on options. We're short on internal permission. And I want to give you something more honest than another slogan about giving yourself permission, an actual look at what makes it so hard to grant and what it takes to build. So we'll get into where this habit comes from, what waiting is quietly protecting you from, and just as important, how to tell the difference between finally authorizing your own life and just making an impulsive mess of it. Let's get into it. Okay, here's the tension at the center of today's episode. Most of the people this show is built for have done a lot of the right things. You built the career or you're building it. You've hit the markers other people recognize as success. You've read the books, done some of the inner work, maybe even given yourself permission to slow down here and there. And somewhere underneath all of that competence, there's a decision you haven't made, a conversation you haven't had, a version of your life you can picture clearly and haven't let yourself move toward, not because you lack the resources and not because you lack the self awareness, but because some part of you is still waiting for someone to tell you it's okay. My take on this is direct. Waiting for permission isn't a character flaw, and it isn't a personality trait. It's a learned decision system. It was trained into you, usually by people who loved you, in a context that made sense at the time, which means it can be examined and it can be retrained. I'm not going to tell you today to blow up your life. That's not what this is. What I want to do is take the phrase give yourself permission, which gets thrown around so casually it's basically lost its meaning, and actually look at what it requires because it's harder and more responsible than it sounds. So let's start with what this actually looks like because the pattern hides pretty well. So we want to be able to help recognize that specific familiar shape of the permission problem in our own lives. So that way we have a framework to be able to move forward with it. The permission problem doesn't usually look like indecision, it looks like competence. It looks like someone who's extremely good at gathering information, weighing options, building a mental spreadsheet of pros and cons, and somehow never quite arriving at the decision they already know they want to make. It shows up as waiting, waiting for the kids to be older, waiting for the mortgage to be paid down, waiting for a sign, a layoff, a diagnosis, a divorce, something external to hand you the permission you haven't been willing to give yourself. Waiting for a parent to understand, a partner to agree, a boss to make it easy by firing you first. Here's the tell. If you can describe exactly what you want and exactly why you haven't moved, and the reason isn't a hard constraint like money or safety, but something closer to, I don't think I'm allowed, you're not looking at an information problem. You're looking at a permission problem. You know, sometimes this manifests itself in staying in a career past the point it fits. We get so comfortable, we just keep doing it, and we don't ever stop to think about, is this serving us anymore? Are there better options for us? Should we be doing something differently? We're just on those default settings. Or maybe we're in a relationship, we're staying quiet about wanting something different because we're just not sure how the other person's going to react. And so the expectation is that we're supposed to be in this particular relationship with this sort of setup and dynamic. And so we don't want to mess up the apple cart. Or maybe we're holding on to an identity. We're the reliable one, we're the ambitious one, and we don't want to be that anymore. But that's what we're associated with. So it's sort of past its expiration date and we're still stuck there. So that's different than genuinely not knowing what you want. And this can happen as well. I mean, if you don't know what you want, it may take some soul searching and some figuring out to get there. But the difference here is in those circumstances, you know it, you feel it. You may not have sat with it enough to bring it to the forefront or frame it in ways where you could articulate it, but you could feel it there. And so those are two different things because they get treated as the same problem, but they're not. And so this will show up really differently depending on how much conventional success somebody has, because the right boxes that someone's checked, the more of those that you've done, the harder this gets because there's more for other people to be confused or disappointed by, right? If you change, you're doing everything well. Why would you change this now? So think about your own life and think about specific areas of your life that come to mind while we were talking about that story, because those might be clues to the fact that there might be something more there. You know, I've been in a situation in my professional life where I was in a role and I thought this is the role that I'm supposed to be in and it's the responsible thing to do it and everything else. But I had other things in mind. I had other desires, other ambitions. And my concern was, again, just like I shared, it wasn't anything real that was keeping me there. It was a perception that if I didn't continually do what I was supposed to be doing, that a lots around me would change. And that change, that uncertainty creates anxiety. It can be a little bit scary. And so it's important that at least though we recognize and acknowledge it because the decision was functionally made before the permission arrived in those particular situations. You know it in your mind, you know it in your body, you know it in your heart that there's something different that you want to be doing, and yet there's something holding you back. So waiting doesn't produce more clarity. It just delays the same ultimate conclusion. So if that's what the pattern looks like, where does it actually come from? Because nobody's born waiting for permission. This gets built. So if we want to trace the developmental and cultural origins of the permission problem, then we need to start looking at ourselves even as kids. If we start here as kids, then we learn what's acceptable almost entirely through other people's reactions. A parent's approval, a teacher's praise, a peer group's acceptance. We all know, maybe we even are, that kind of person that scans the room when we do something to see how people react. If the reaction is positive, we keep doing it. If it's negative, we stop because we're aware. And even if we're like that as adults, we're certainly like that as kids because that's the only place we get that sort of information from. So that peer group's acceptance, that teacher's praise, that parent approval, those aren't just nice to have as a child. They're safety information. Being liked and being safe are for a long time functionally the same thing. We need that in our early lives. So we build an early decision system that runs on outside signals. Good grades, approved. Rocking the boat, not approved. Following the visible validated path, approved. Doing something nobody around you has a category for, met with confusion, worry, and sometimes real alarm. And that system isn't wrong exactly. It's supposed to be temporary scaffolding. The problem is that for a lot of capable adults, it never does get replaced. It just gets more sophisticated. So instead of a parent's approval, it's a professional credential. Instead of a teacher's praise, it's a title, a salary band, a version of your life that makes sense to people at a dinner party. Conventional achievement doesn't cure the permission problem. It often trains it further. The more validated the path that you're on, the more evidence you accumulate that following approved paths works. And that makes stepping off of one feel like less like a choice and more like a risk to the whole operating system. And so when we start thinking about what's right for us and what's legible to other people, so they can understand what it is, that's really the thing we want to sit with is the decision making that I'm going through, is the reasoning for what I'm doing, the fact that it's the simple, easy path and everybody else will understand what I'm doing, or does it feel right to who I am? And I think even a lot of adult decisions, as grown adults, we still continue to talk to our parents and we talk to our spouse and our friends and maybe former classmates. And in those cases, there are expectations there because they have a perception of us in a certain way. And so Sometimes if you step out of that, it can be very scary and you don't know how other people are going to react. And that's part of the complication with it. It isn't just what we want, but it's what other people expect of us. So in all of those particular cases, I mean, we usually want sign off from parents, partners, employers, peer groups, credential experts, sometimes an audience that exists mostly in our own head. When we share an idea with somebody and they say, "Oh, that's great," it reinforces what we want. But oftentimes, the whole reason we were sharing it was to test it, was to validate it. And when we get that validation, that external validation gives us the permission to go do it. The reality of it is, we should be doing it anyway if that's what the right thing for us. Obviously, within the context of the life that we live, but we should be doing that anyway, or at least doing our best to move in that direction instead of waiting for other people to tell us that it's okay. And so people are wired to treat what everyone else is doing as evidence about what's safe and correct. We look collectively at things and we say, this path makes sense, this is logical, this is smart, this path is not smart, this path is risky, or whatever the case may be. And we need to understand that the right choice for us isn't the popular one. I know it's sort of a overused analogy or idea, but look, the people that changed the world are often people that looked at it in a completely different direction and did something that nobody expected. When Edison was working on the light bulb and he had notebooks full of failed ways to create the carbon filament, he had a young reporter ask him, "How many times are you going to do this? You've done this 10,000 times. It's never going to work. Don't you realize that?" And his response was, "You don't understand. I've successfully identified 10,000 ways that don't work, which means I'm exactly 10,000 ways closer to the one that will." Totally different frame of mind, but how many people would have given up after 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000 attempts? And you see the impact that it's had on modern day life. And so it's super important to understand that, because while that kind of stuff gets us connected as kids and gives us a sense of belonging, it's not something that we necessarily need. We may be able to shed that as adults. So the system that trained you to seek approval isn't malicious. It's really designed to help you out, but it's just outdated for the decisions that you're facing now. And that raises the real question. If waiting doesn't actually protect you from bad outcomes, what is it protecting you from? So here's an idea worth sitting with. Delay isn't just the absence of decision, it's doing something for you. As long as you haven't decided, you haven't had to be responsible for the outcome. You haven't had to disappoint anybody. You haven't had to find out whether the new version of your life actually works or discover that it doesn't and have to live with having chosen that. Waiting keeps the door open. That closes the moment you walk through it in either direction. There's also a quieter cost people avoid looking at directly, disappointing the people who benefited from the old version of you. The version who was always available, always ambitious, always the reliable one, always following the plan everyone agreed on. Changing doesn't just cost you something, it can cost the people around you something too. And some part of you may be protecting them from that loss more than you're protecting yourself from risk. And then there's identity. Changing course can make you unrecognizable to other people and sometimes to yourself. There's a well documented psychological pull toward keeping our actions consistent with our own self image and past choices. When they don't line up, it creates real internal friction. And the mind will often work harder to resolve that friction by rationalizing the status quo than by actually changing course. Add in everything that you've already invested: years, money, reputation, a story you've told people about who you are. And staying put starts to feel less like inertia and more like integrity, even when it isn't. Now, when we spend years in a career, we spend years in focused on a particular degree or a title or a reputation that we built. The challenge with that is, while it feels safe, the risk is that we wake up years later and we realize, when we reflect, that we weren't focused, we weren't settled in the area that we really wanted to be, and we weren't doing the things that we wanted to do. And that is a real risk. There's that old saying that on their deathbed, people never regret that they didn't spend more time at the office. They always regret they didn't spend more time with their family, people that they love, It's difficult to do that on a daily basis. But if you cast the shadow backward and you take a look at how you're going to feel 10 years from now, if you continue to do what you're currently doing, that's going to give you some really good clues. Are you going to feel fulfilled? Or are you going to feel like you didn't put your time and energy in the right places? And that's how you can help distinguish whether you're making the responsible choice or is it just the familiar one. And status and reputation matters in this case as well. A lot of people feel like, hey, I can't do that. It's really because they can't be seen doing that. I think it was Greg Giraldo, the comedian. I could be wrong about this, but I think it was Greg Giraldo. He was a Harvard lawyer. He went to Harvard, got his law degree, and he wasn't happy. He didn't like what he was doing. So he switched and became a stand-up comic. That's ballsy to drop a career that you have a path laid out for you where you're going to be financially successful, you're going to be esteemed, everyone's going to look up to you, to go into a really highly risky profession that you don't know if you're going to be successful or not takes a lot of guts. But that's the difference between focusing on the thing that you really want to do versus the thing that you think you're supposed to do. And so there's an asymmetry between the fear of regret and the fear of judgment. You may feel judged right now if you do something, but down the road, you don't want to look back and say, I wish I did that because that's really where I wanted to be. But people are often more afraid of how a decision will look than how it'll actually feel to live with. And those are not the same. And in the future, there's only one that's going to really upset you. So the research on regret suggests that people tend to regret the things they didn't do more than the things that they did, and for longer. And so, even though in the moment the fear of taking the wrong action feels louder than the fear of never having tried, the reality of it is usually the opposite. So, some delay is legitimate. No one's suggesting impetuously jump around and run to every shiny object that you feel or see. But the reality of it is, once you've made that decision, if there's some thought and some processing in order to get to where you want to be, then go for it. But once you've collected that information, you need to then make the decision based on what is right for you in your life. Because you could be doing protective work that has nothing to do with wisdom, and all you're doing is delaying for the sake of not making a decision. So I think that's a super important point, and I think it's really important that we're able to focus on that and think about what it is that really matters to us and the motivation behind the feeling and the decisions we're making or not making. Now, I want to be really careful here because this is exactly the point where an episode like this, things can go wrong. The reality of it is, it'd be easy right about now to swing hard the other way and tell you, stop waiting, trust yourself, just go. That's not what I'm telling you. That version of this message is just as dishonest as the one it's reacting against. Giving yourself permission is not the same thing as doing whatever you want. Self-authorship is not rebellion. It's responsibility that answers to you instead of automatically deferring to whoever happens to be in the room. So let's draw the actual lines. Courage is acting in the direction of something you've examined and still believe in, even though it's frightening. Recklessness is acting to relieve the discomfort of not having decided yet. They can feel identical in the moment, but they're not the same thing. Alignment is a decision that holds up when you're calm, you're rested, and honest with yourself. Avoidance is a decision that only makes sense when you're activated, exhausted, or trying to escape something uncomfortable. Alignment tends to survive a good night's sleep. Avoidance often doesn't. Internal authority means you've done the work to trust your own judgment, and it still listens. It still takes in feedback, still weighs the people it affects, still holds the possibility that it's wrong about something. Refusing feedback isn't authority, it's just insulation. An authentic desire is different from a strong feeling that happens to be visiting you this week. A genuine signal tends to be consistent. It shows up in your quiet moments as well as your dramatic ones, and it survives contact with real information. A temporary emotional reaction is loud, and it's usually gone in a way that authentic desire isn't. And so, if your values are misaligned with what you're trying to do, then that's ultimately not going to feel right either at the end of the day. And so the difference here, or an example of this, would be you have an argument with a partner or spouse or whatever. So you end the relationship. Well, that's an impetuous decision that's based on right now. That's different from considering, reflecting, and realizing, you know what, we aren't compatible. We don't want the same things. This isn't healthy or happy for either one of us. So you end the relationship for that reason. That's the difference and the distinction. One's based in emotion and heat of the moment. The other one is based on legitimate alignment. And so it's important. The other thing it's important to be realistic about is legitimate obligations, financial responsibilities, caregiving, health, commitments to other people. Those things and honoring those things is super important. And doing those instead of what you want to be doing is not the same thing as being permission seeking or afraid. And it's super important that we make that distinction because a responsible adult weighs real constraints. They don't just let someone else's comfort be the final vote, but they also don't just dump all their responsibilities to follow their dreams. It's a balance here, right? And so maybe you're thinking, but how do I actually know which one I'm doing? And to be honest, there's no perfect test. There's only better and worse questions. And that's the framework that we're trying to talk about and discuss here, because this is a process of feeling things out. You know, recklessness can often masquerade as decisiveness because it looks like finally taking action, but that is what makes it dangerous. Speed is not the same thing as clarity. So if permission isn't just go with your gut and isn't wait for someone else to decide for you either, then what is it? I mean, what actually has to be built? Here's the core move. Permission is not something you receive, it's a capacity you build. That reframe matters. Receiving permission implies you're waiting on someone or something outside yourself to hand it over. Building the capacity to authorize your own life implies work, specific, doable work, most of it internal. That work starts with self knowledge, which is why this connects directly to what we talk about on the show as the inner life, your actual values as opposed to the ones you've inherited or performed, your real patterns as opposed to the story you tell about yourself, the difference between a fear that's protecting you from something real and a fear that's just familiar. Self knowledge doesn't remove the difficulty of a decision. What it does is let you tell the difference between hesitation that's wisdom and hesitation that's just fear wearing a very convincing disguise. Without it, you're either permanently stuck or you're making big moves based on information you've never actually examined. And here's something worth knowing because it removes a lot of pressure. Clarity usually doesn't come before you act, it comes from acting in small, honest, reversible ways and paying attention to what you learn. So most people wait for certainty before they'll let themselves take a step. But for most of the decisions we're talking about today, certainty is downstream of experimentation. It isn't upstream of it. So if we want to be self-authors of our ongoing lives, then it's important that we do that with 100 small decisions before we realize any one big one, because we need to weigh that real responsibility without treating other people's comfort as the deciding vote. It's always this balancing act. So there's a difference between, does this hurt someone that I have a genuine obligation to, and does this make someone uncomfortable with who I'm becoming? The first, we don't want to neglect our responsibility. The second, we need to be owning our own identity and our own priorities and doing the things that make us feel whole. And so it's great if you can have a trusted outside perspective here, because if you're able to do that and it's somebody who would be honest with you, that can also be a great sounding board, because we don't want to treat consensus and approval as the same thing as being right. But also, if we have somebody that we can talk to about it, that's valuable as well. So the key thing here is that that's the theory. Let's make it practical. What does this actually look like on a day-to-day basis? Self-authorization doesn't usually start with the big visible decision. It starts small and it starts private before it's ever public. It can look like saying an honest sentence out loud to one person that you trust instead of just thinking it. It can look like spending real money or real time on a version of the thing that you've been circling before you're ready to commit to it fully. It can look like letting yourself want something for a week without immediately auditing whether you're allowed to want it. Each of those is a small act of authority. None of them require anyone else's sign off, and each one builds the evidence base you'll actually need. Evidence about yourself, not permission from someone else, before you make a bigger move. So we can distinguish a real inner signal from three imposters. And this is important as well. So there's avoidance, I want to leave. That's really, I want to escape discomfort. There's fantasy, I want to leave. That's really a story about an idealized life with none of the real texture of a new one. And temporary emotional spike, a bad week masquerading as permanent truth. And so if we want a genuine signal, it tends to survive time, information, and a bad mood. If we're talking about avoidance and fantasy, they tend to lose their shape the minute that you get specific about the logistics or the minute that things go briefly well again in the old situation. And this is a quiet, unglamorous, and slow process. It's not going to look from the outside like the dramatic transformation stories the culture usually rewards, and that's fine. It isn't supposed to. So let's take everything we've covered and turn it into something you can actually use. I'm not going to give you 5 steps. I don't think this reduces to steps. What I can give you is a set of questions, lenses really, worth sitting with honestly before you either act or keep waiting. You don't need to answer all 7 today. Some of them will take longer than a podcast episode to actually answer, but asking them is precisely most of the work. So we want to go through each of these questions and just think about them and maybe store them for later, go back to them as well. What am I actually waiting to be given permission for? Name it specifically. Vague longing doesn't get evaluated well. A specific decision does. Whose approval have I been treating as decisive? And have I ever actually asked them, or have I just assumed what they'd say? What legitimate responsibility do I need to account for here? The real ones, not the imagined disapproval of people who don't actually depend on me. Of the delay I've been in, how much of it is wisdom and how much of it is fear wearing wisdom's clothes? What's the smallest honest experiment I could run, something real, reversible, and specific that would teach me something I don't currently know? What evidence would actually help me tell the difference between alignment and escape? And have I gathered any of it, or have I just been feeling my way through this? And what is remaining exactly as I am already costing me? Not hypothetically, but right now, this year, and have I been honest with myself about that cost? That last one is worth sitting with the longest because it's the one people skip. We tend to treat the current version of our life as the neutral, risk-free option, and any change is the risky one. But staying has a cost too. It's just quieter because it's already priced into your life and you've stopped noticing it. So let's bring this together. Most of us don't lack the options to live differently. We lack the sense that we're allowed to use them. That sense of permission was never actually something other people had the authority to grant. It just felt that way because we learned a long time ago to treat their comfort as evidence. The work isn't becoming more rebellious. It's becoming more responsible. Responsible enough to weigh your real obligations honestly, curious enough to know your own patterns, and patient enough to let clarity come from trying rather than demanding it arrive before you're willing to move. Here's the line I want to leave you with. Permission was never something you were missing. It was something you hadn't finished building. So here's a question I'd genuinely like you to sit with after this episode ends. Not answer right now, just carry with you. Where in your life are you waiting for someone else to tell you it's okay, when the truth is, you're the only one with the authority to actually decide? If this episode is connecting with something in you, if you're noticing your own patterns, your own inner narrative about what you're allowed to want, I'd point you toward the Mind and Inner Life page on Optimize. It goes much deeper into the self-knowledge work that makes this kind of clarity possible. And if what's landing for you is more about the shape of your own growth, becoming more fully yourself instead of just more accomplished, I've also linked the growth and self-becoming pillar in the show notes. It picks up a lot of what we touched on today about experimentation, identity, and timeline. You don't have to resolve any of this today. You just have to be honest about where you're waiting and curious about why.